History is not written by subtle people. Carved into stone by claimants, painted red with the blood of conquerors, and recited by survivors. In the bloody saga of royal dynasties, few people have cried out louder and loved more. Destroyed itself more violently and more spectacularly than its home. Plantagenet, imagine a family, a worried father. The engine of a man who never sleeps, building an empire that stretches from the cold mists of Scotland to the sun. Burnt Pyrenees, twice crowned queen, even a mother who was a very powerful woman. Her husband was afraid of her. Her sons, each eager to please, were like a pack of lion cubs. They tear apart their own fathers for the crown. This is not a fairy tale. This is a 300-year-old family tragedy, a chess game where the pieces are kingdoms and everything. The action could end with a dagger in the dark. They were the French who ruled. England, the French-speaking kings who, by chance, shaped the English identity. They gave us the Magna Carta. The foundation of Western law is not because they believe in freedom, but because one of their own rights has failed. It is pitiful to see the baron holding a sword to his throat. They started the war so that lasted for over a century because one of them thought he would look better on the French crown. And when they were done, in order to kill the French, they attacked each other so savagely that they almost wiped out their entire lineage. Today's journey is a treasure hunt. This treasure is the answer to one big question. How could a dynasty with such extraordinary energy and talent rule? To suffocate his own legacy with his own hands, we must go back to find him. The beginning, the great founder, a crowned demon who devoured both seeds. His greatness and destruction sowed the weeds at the foundation of his dynasty. His name was Henry II. In the middle of the 12th century, England was a failed state. For 20 years, a civil war, poetically known as anarchy, had torn it apart. As one chronicler wrote, this was a period when Christ and his saints slept. Warlords built illegal forts, minted their own coins, and terrorized the countryside. The crown of England was nothing more than a bloody trinket passed down between the fearsome cousins Stephen and his cousins Matilda. The nation was on its knees, bleeding from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. A master prays for any master, and then from across the English Channel. In 1189, a stormtrooper named Henry Plantagenet arrived on the coast. He was only 21 years old, but he was already a political giant. By birthright, he was Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, with the sword. And in the most brilliant marriage of the Middle Ages, she became a queen and a vast kingdom. His wife was Helena of Aquitaine from 1122 to 1204, the formidable ex-wife of the French king, and with her came a territory stretching as far as southwestern France. The Spanish border. When Henry landed in England in 1153 to claim the throne, he wasn't just another suitor. He was a multinational real estate tycoon whose portfolio accidentally included a broken company. Island Kingdom. His kingdom, later called the Angevin Empire, was not a country. Was a private collection of territories, and Henry was its hyperactive CEO. They say Henry never sat down. He was a man of demonic energy. Constantly on the move, a whirlwind of administrative fury. Illegal castles. He created a single royal currency. He sent judges to all parts of the country, thereby making the king's justice accessible to all, not just the powerful. This was the birth of English common law, a system based on precedent and royal statutes, not abstract theory. Authority, a system robust enough to be exported anywhere in the world. He returned. An illegitimate regression to the most ruled kingdom in Europe. He was a force of nature, a restorer of order. The king who led his new country from the dark ages into the light of a centralized state and shouted, state, but the same fire that builds a kingdom can also burn its king, and even more terrible was his own family. A king who ruled the land and the law is strong, but a king who also controls the soul of his nation. Absolutely. This was Henry's greatest ambition, and to achieve it he had to tame one. An institution that claims a higher authority than its own, the Church. His plan was a stroke of political genius, or so he thought. He has appointed his own man to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury, England's highest religious office. And who is more suitable for the position? More than his dearest friend, the brilliant, worldly, hard-partying Chancellor Thomas Becket, 1120–1170. Their friendship was legendary. The king and the chancellor were inseparable, a dynamic duo that ruled England. Henry saw this. Becket was a loyal servant who would subjugate the church to the king's will. Thus, in 1162, appointed him archbishop. This was his biggest mistake, because Thomas Becket got into trouble. A change so profound that it seemed miraculous. A man dressed in silk and finery. Wine suddenly wore a rough hair shirt under his clothes. He became the king's man. He was a man of God, and he embraced his new role with the unwavering enthusiasm of a man whose faith had changed. He resigned as chancellor and began to systematically oppose every attempt from the king to ensure control over the church. Friendship intertwined. The bitter rivalry that captivated Europe and caused scandal. This was the Cold War. He fought over legal documents such as the Clarendon Constitutions, which forced clergy to report to the royal family. Courts. The conflict reached its climax on a cold December evening in 1170. Henry in Normandy, driven mad by the latest news of Becket's disobedience, cried out in pure despair in front of his palace, "What pitiful sounds! And I have raised and raised traitors in my house, who allow their masters to behave so shamefully." Hatred by a low-class clerk. Some accounts recall it more simply. More terrifying. Will no one be able to save me from this disturbing priest? It was a rhetorical question, a king's hateful exclamation at its peak. But his 4 knights, hearing only a royal command, ruled by royal anger, did not believe his word. They mounted their horses. Canterbury stormed the church and killed Thomas Becket. The steps of his own altar. In an instant, a political opponent became a holy martyr. The backlash was overwhelming. Henry, the Lord of Europe, was forced to suffer the most terrible public humiliation. He walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury to be flogged by monks at Becket's tomb. He won a legal battle. Argued, but he had lost the moral war. And yet the greatest threat to Henry was his life and legacy were neither a martyred priest, nor a pope, nor a French king. The greatest danger destroyed him. He had his own desk. He had a wife named Elelena, who was indomitable, tired of his betrayals and political activities. And he had 4 surviving sons. Henry was crowned as a young king to rule with her. Richard, his mother's favorite, set out for Aquitaine. Geoffrey, the cunning Duke of Britain, and his youngest, the landless John, won his father's pet. They were known as the devil's offspring, Henry's failure. His father was a mirror image of his success as a king. He was a micromanager. He was a genius, but he could not delegate anything to anyone else. He could not let go. He told his sons, although they earned grand titles, they concealed no real power and were treated like students who were never allowed to touch the tools of art, empowered by their own ambitions and professionally manipulated by their vindictive mother. They began to see their father not as a patriarch, but as a tyrant who stood in their way. In 1173, something unthinkable happened. The devil's offspring are in alliance with their mother and supported by the King of France, the King of Scotland, and half of the barons of the empire rose up in a great rebellion against their father. It was a family feud that escalated into an international war. the old lion. He was surrounded on all sides by his own children, but he was not finished yet. With the fierce energy that characterized him, Henry II suppressed the rebellion. He forgave the rebellion. It was an act of mercy that he would regret, his sons, but he did not forgive his wife. Elelena of Aquitaine was placed under house arrest, where she would wait like a lioness in a cage for 15 years. The war was over, but the peace was rotten to the core. The family was broken. Forever, the last 10 years of Henry's reign were not a rule, but a slow and agonizing hemorrhage. The peace he brought to his family was a fiction. He was not the offspring of Satan. Defeated, just scattered, waiting for the next opportunity. It came again. And yet, his successor, the young King Henry, died of opposition while in the open. He rebelled against his father for the second time, embracing a sacred relic, and he begged for forgiveness which he did not deserve. Another son, Geoffrey, trampled to death at the Paris tournament, which ended in a violence fit for one. A man known for his treachery, but the final fatal blow came from him. Remaining sons, his magnificent warrior son Richard allied himself with Henry's mortal enemy, along with King Philip of France. They waged war together. The aging king corners him, defeats his army's forces. A humiliating peace. Henry, sick with fever and broken spirit, was taken to his. In the castle of Shinner, he wanted to see the list of the rebels. He had plotted against him with Richard. At the top of the list, the first. The name he read was that of his youngest, dearest son, John. This end, the heart of an old lion who has endured excommunication, rebellion, and other hardships. His friend's murder was finally thwarted. They say he turned his back on. He leaned against the wall and muttered, "Now let the world d. Oh, as it pleases, I don't care about anything." More, on his deathbed, he was heard cursing his own children whom he had raised. To be king, his last coherent words were whispered. The history books were proof of his final defeat. Shame, shame. The conquered king. So what is the legacy of Henry II? It's a paradox of epic proportions. He was the architect of modernity. The English state, the father of common law, a ruler of enormous ability who committed fraud. His administrative and legal reforms were so profound that it has resonated for centuries and still forms the foundation of justice for nations. Unborn, but the foundation of his house was built on sand and covered with salt. He created such a great centralized power, such a brilliant crown that his own sons found something irresistible to take over. He taught them how to fight, how to rule, how to be lions. I just never imagined they would turn their claws on him. He had won England, but he had lost his family. He had built something. Kingdom, but his dynasty had destroyed it before it could even truly begin. The great king is dead. The throne of England, the center of the vast Angevin Empire, is vacant, and he takes over. One of his sons, who accompanied him to his grave, is the man who now goes down in history as Richard. Lionhearted, golden warrior, icon of the Crusades, famous poet, but a king who looked upon England with all the emotional attachment of a landowner. A remote, profitable, but rather boring farm, another one waiting in the wings. Feathered John in the lion's den, a treacherous darling, always vigilant. Constantly cunning, the empire was built and maintained by the superhuman power of a single man. Can a seemingly despised hero survive by being inherited? And a villain who is already trying to betray him. The lion cubs are now free. Of the old lion cage, the big question is, will they build on top of their own cage? Will their father's fragmented legacy, or will Europe's greatest empire be the first victim of their sibling rivalry? If Henry II was a business-minded CEO, his successor was Richard the Lionheart, a famous superstar who inherited the company but only came for a photo shoot. Richard was completely medieval. The king was supposed to be in a fairy tale. He was tall, handsome, and scary. Warrior and composer of elegant poetry, he was a legend in his own language. For life, the only problem was that he had absolutely no interest in becoming King of England. For Richard, England. It wasn't a house. It was a bank, an offshore account that the wealthy could easily access. Fund his one true passion, his glorious, sun-drenched, soul-saving business. Holy War. His first step after taking the crown was not to reform the laws or meet his demands, but to hold the largest garage sale in British history. He cancelled national wealth with the zeal of a man in need of money. He sold castles until the lords and high officials made the highest offer. He famously joked, "If I could find a buyer, I would sell London itself." It was all to finance his participation in the Third Crusade, an A-list celebrity tour to the Holy Land, representing himself and his great rival, King Philip II of France. And then, after emptying the treasury, he left. During his 10-year reign, Richard spent about 6 months on English soil. He lost his kingdom, his money, his fame abroad, to secure his power at home, but he had forgotten one person. It was his younger brother John, who wanted this power more than anyone else. The living embodiment of the little brother syndrome, he has spent his entire life the shadow of the magnificent Richard, although Richard was his mother's favorite. John was his father's, but it had resulted in the ultimate betrayal. Unlike his brothers, his father mocked him with the nickname Lackland. He had not been able to allocate a territory for him at first. He had very big ambitions, but he was not cursed with Richard's charisma or military charm. He was a cunning, visionary man. Conspiracy in every shadow, for he himself lived in them, and Richard. John, who played the role of hero, saw his opportunity. He began to weave a web of intrigue. Whispers poison into the ears of anxious barons, and the most dangerous in the ears of Richard's rival King Philip, according to rumors, some true, some not. John, returning from a crusade of hardship and disagreement, spread by John himself, tried and took action to seize control of the kingdom and declare himself the rightful heir. The kingdom abandoned by the heroic king was now prayed for by the vulture. Waiting at home, Richard was magnificent in the Holy Land. He was a brilliant tactician and a truly inspiring frontline commander. He personally leads the attacks with sword in hand. He captured the important port city of Aix-en-Provence and defeated the vast armies of Saladin. Open battle in Asuf. A legend was born about mutual respect between two people. Fearsome enemy. As perhaps apocryphal stories were told about Saladin sending fresh fruit and snow from the mountains to cool the English king during his fall. Fell ill with a fever, but for all his bravery on the battlefield, Richard. Diplomatic disaster. He inadvertently insulted other crusade leaders, most of whom, in particular, he had torn down the flag of Duke Leopold of Austria and thrown it to the ground. He won the battles, but he could not win the war. Jerusalem was left out. His crusade was a public relations victory, but it was a strategic victory. Failure. The journey home sealed his fate. He was shipwrecked in the Adriatic Sea, forced to. While traveling disguised in the lands of the new Austrian enemy, he was inevitably discovered and taken prisoner. The Duke Leopold, remembering the insult to his flag, took his prize prisoner and sold it to his master, Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who saw the King of England as the last lottery ticket. What happened next? It was the most expensive kidnapping in history. A king's ransom was demanded. An astonishing 150,000 marks, such a large sum that it was 2 or 3 times as much. The entire annual income of the English crown, government in England. John had failed to usurp. He had to drain the country using crushing agents. Taxes on everyone from churches to peasants to reclaim their poor king. Finally, He returned briefly to regain his power. He forgave his traitorous brother John, saying, "He is just one child," but England no longer appealed. He returned to France to fight, to defend his true enemy, Philippi, and his beloved French possessions. In 1199, the story of the great lion Malu ended not with a roar, but with a sound. Grown, he was not defeated in the climactic battle, but was killed by the gang. Green, infected with a crossbow bolt fired by a boy from the walls of a minor. Insignificant castle, so the crown passed to John, cunning, unsuccessful. The kid was already a king, and he was going to get a master class on how to lose. An empire. Across the channel, King Philip II of France, a patient and cunning politician. The spider was waiting. He couldn't compete with Richard in a fight, but he knew that John was a completely different animal. Philip used complex rules. Feudal law was his weapon. As Duke of Normandy, John was technically Philip's. When John got into an argument with one of his servants, the Licinians appealed to their last ruler, Philip. Philip, seeing the opportunity, summoned John to his court in Paris to answer the charges. John, with typical Plantagenet arrogance, but with none of the genius that accompanied him, refused. This was the most serious. By rejecting the challenge, he had caused a miscalculation of his life. Philip now had a perfect legal excuse to confiscate all of John's lands. In France, and he did it, one by one, large territories of the Angevin Empire. Normandy, the center of the dynasty, was lost in 1204 after the fall. The supposedly impregnable Chateau Gau, Richard's masterpiece. Anjou men trained, they're all gone. John wasn't just incompetent, he was cruel and paranoid, alienating the Norman barons who needed his support. He had his father's terrible temper, but none of his political skill. His brother's ambition, but none of his inspiring leadership. Empire. In this project, which Henry II built with unremitting energy throughout his life, John lost less. For more than 5 years, the name Lackland had become a fulfilled prophecy. Defeated, humiliated, and back in England, John did everything he could to be cornered. Tyrants do that. He turned his cruelty against his own people if he couldn't win the war. Abroad, he made money at the expense of his own citizens. His first victim was Church. In a political chess match he was desperately ready to play. He began a dispute with Pope Innocent III, the most powerful man in Christendom, for his next appointment. Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope responded with a prohibition, the spiritual equivalent of nuclear weapons. 1208. England was under spiritual quarantine for 6 years. Church bells. He was silent. Marriages could not be consecrated. The dead could not receive. Christian funerals and newborn babies could not be baptized, because deep down, for the religious people of the Middle Ages, this was a national curse, a sign of their king had brought them all into the grace of God, when the souls of his people were in danger. John turned to his baron. He needed a large sum of money. He financed a campaign to reclaim his French heritage. He did this not only through blackmail, but also through methods, but vindictive and personal. He carried out attacks instead of military operations. Unprecedented level of service. In fact, he gets paid for it by his baron. The privilege of not fighting and losing wars. He used his feudal rights to sell them. He gave away aristocratic widows and heirs to the highest bidder. He demanded a very large sum of money. Paid fines for imaginary crimes in hell. The children of his nobles hostage. For his good behavior, he wasn't just a failed king. He was a gangster and the throne defense racket. Finally, the breaking point came in 1215. The most powerful barons in England had considerable power. They were warriors, not ATMs. They raised an army and they abandoned their oaths of allegiance and plunged the kingdom into civil war. They did not imprison John in the castle. a water meadow on the banks of the rivers called Runny. Here its death, they demanded his signature. They presented him with a document, a list. The demands known to history as the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. To be clear, Magna Carta was not a grand declaration. We often imagine universal human rights. This is a deeply practical, profound, a charter of lucrative liberties for the elite. It was about inheritance taxes, fishing rights, and the standard. A yard of cloth, but seeds were buried in its 63 stanzas. A revolution. One clause stated that no free person could be imprisoned or deprived of their property rights. Property, except by a lawful decision of equal persons or by the law of the land. Most importantly, he created a council of 25 barons to ensure the king's safety. He kept his promises. The unspoken message shook the earth. The king was not above the law. For a Plantagenet, a descendant of the all-powerful Henry II, this was the ultimate degradation. Power was not a gift from God, it was a. He had made a contract, and he simply had to agree to the terms. John sealed the charter, but he had no intention of following it. He immediately was annulled by the Pope, his new ally, and the civil war escalated. But John would not see the end of it. In 1216, while campaigning, he was involved in oppositionism in the east of England, allegedly after a bout of greed. He died of a fever and broken bones at Newark Castle, at a feast of peaches and new cider. Man, his kingdom was in chaos. It was a pitiful, undignified end. Dominance is defined by failure. The hero Richard the Lionheart went left behind a legend, an empty treasure, and a kingdom he barely knows. John Lackland, the villain, left behind a legacy of disastrous failure. But in the ruins of his reign, an idea was born. It turned out that even a king had to obey the law. The Plantagenets had reached rock bottom. The great Angevin Empire was a distant memory. The reign of the crown was shaken. Its power was legally limited for the first time. How could a dynasty? How can one deal with the claw to bounce back from such a complete and utter disgrace? What happens when a 9-year-old boy, John's son Henry III, inherits it? A shattered kingdom, civil war, and the poisoned chalice of Magna Carta. If he survives, the Plantagenets will only need another warrior king or cunning schemer. They will need a legislator, a builder, an iron-willed man with a vision to restore the kingdom. Power and the ruthlessness to expand it, beyond anything their ancestors had ever possessed, was imagined before the dynasty was reborn in the fire first. To endure a long, mixed, and deeply religious reign, which would also lay the groundwork. One of England's most feared and terrifying kings, history was waiting for a man who would earn the nickname Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots. The one who inherited the ruins of John's kingdom was his 9-year-old son, Henry III. His reign lasted 56 years, one of the longest in British history. It was a master class in pious and well-intentioned mediocrity, unlike his Plantagenet predecessors. Henry was not a warrior. He was a man of refined taste, a patron of the arts. His greatest legacy is the magnificent Gothic rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, a sanctuary designed to honor God and his beloved royal saint, Edward. Confessor, he was a faithful husband and a caring father, in other generations too. If he had worked, he would have been a wonderful man. As a king, he was almost a disaster. He lacked the iron will of his grandfather and the military charm of his uncle. He controlled the environment. He grouped himself with foreign favorites and relatives and gave them land and offices, which angered the local resident. An English baron, he dreamed of restoring the empire, but he lacked the funds. And the focus is on launching expensive and ineffective campaigns in France. His weakness and political naivety created a power vacuum, and this vacuum was filled by a man who was for a time more king than himself, Simon d'Ant 1208. In 1265, the Earl of Leicester, de Montfort, Henry's own brother-in-law, led a radical group. As a result of a baronial rebellion, he captured the king and his heir and ruled England for about a year. For wider support, de Montfort called together not only ordinary nobles and bishops, but also the Grand Council, as well as the Knights of the Lions and, for the first time, the burgesses. From the cities, it was not a democracy, but it was a parliament, another fundamental piece of the English state. Born not of royal wisdom, but of rebellion against royal incompetence. It was Henry's son and heir who was forced to watch all this, to endure his father's capture and the humiliation of the kingdom. Edward, it was this whole that shaped him. He saw with his own eyes what had happened. This happened when a king was weak, religious, and easily controlled. He learned his lessons, not in the library, but where he led on the battlefield of Evesham in 1265. The royalist army defeated de Montfort's forces and captured the body of the rebel earl. Brutally mutilated, Edward was a new kind of Plantagenet. He was remarkably tall for his age. He was nicknamed Longtail. He had a fierce, irritable temper, but was driven by a cold, law-abiding, and utterly ruthless ambition. However, while studying the art of war during the Crusades, he heard of his father's death. He hurried home. He made a slow and methodical journey and returned within 2 years. It supplied and monitored continental possessions through Italy and France. Methods of government. He returned to England not only as a king, but also as a legislator and a conqueror. With a terrifyingly clear vision, he would restore the absolute power of the crown and impose his will throughout the British Isles by law or by sword, period. The era of well-meaning amateurs was over. The era of professional tyrants had begun. Edward's first target was Wales. The Welsh princes had long been on the side of the English kings, a land of mountains, fog, and fierce resistance. Edward was not interested in temporary surrender. He wanted complete assimilation, his conquest of Wales. Not a single glorious battle, but a slow, systematic, and ruthless battle. Fell under an entire civilization. He fought with soldiers, but he provided for himself. Victory with stones and mortars. He is the most advanced and the most terrifying castles Europe has ever seen. A large stone necklace around Snowy's neck. Canafin, Conway, Harl, Beaumaris. They weren't just castles, they were huge symbols of British rule and were obvious symbols of a profession that would never end. It was Edward's iron ring, and within it, Welsh independence was stifled. In addition to the final symbolic insult, in 1301, he named his infant son, born at Canopus, the new Prince of Wales, a title. He has remained the English heir to the throne ever since. He didn't just conquer a people, he stole their future. With Wales crushed beneath his heel, Edward turned his cold gaze north. Scotland, here his weapon was not the sword but the law. The Scottish throne was empty. Was mired in a succession crisis, which was widely recognized as a major cause, with 13 rivals. Allegedly, the Scottish nobles made a fatal mistake. They invited Edward, the Firs, known for their legal minds, to arbitrate and choose their next king. It was like inviting a wolf to guard the henhouse. Edward agreed, but one day, provided that all claims first recognize him as a feudal lord. Scotland, they agreed out of desperation. Edward had just legally annexed an entire territory. He chose John Balliol, a weak candidate, who continued to humiliate and treat him like a puppet, making it clear who he was. A true lord, but the Scots were not Welsh. The resistance was first embodied by a common knight, William Wallace. Guerrilla warfare against the British became a legend. Legend Edward. He was brutally murdered in London by Wallace's gruesome execution. But the spirit of resistance did not die with Wallace. It found a new royal champion in Robert the Bruce, Bruce, who claimed the throne, seized his destiny, killed his main rival in the church, and declared himself King of Scotland, to reignite the war for independence. For Edward, this was not just a rebellion. It was blasphemy. It turned his Scottish project into a personal vendetta rather than a legitimate takeover. He directed the full force of his military machine against Scotland. He won the Epitarchtoral Mallas, the hammer of the Scots. His campaigns, remembered for their ruthless efficiency, they crushed the Burridge garrison and, stealing the Stone of Scone, the sacred crown jewel of the Scottish kings, and to take him back to Westminster. This was no longer politics. This was an obsession. This is the legacy of Fern Edward. Written with two contrasting inks, the black ink of the law and the red ink of blood. In England, he was the great builder, the English Justinian. He was the legislator. Genius created a flood of laws defining the rules of land ownership, strengthening the power of the crown. Had legal powers and simplified the machinery of government. His endless. The need for cash to finance their wars was revolutionary, even if unwelcome. Result, he called Parliament more and more often, not at the request of some. Was a proto-democratic ideal, but because he thought it was the most efficient way for the political classes to reach agreement. New taxes, he was the king's community. He had a say in his own wool scouring. He built a stronger state, stronger crown, and a more determined nation. But beyond the borders of England it is. Destroyer hammer, the great cost of the Welsh and Scottish wars. The crown was constantly on the verge of bankruptcy. In addition, he planted the seeds of something. Hatred that would last for centuries. His brutal conquests created a legacy. In Wales, there is a bitter and fierce, unquenchable desire for independence, and Scotland would forever shape the identity of these nations. He united the British Isles under a single crown, his own. Instead, it was torn apart, with a violence that would reverberate for generations. He was a king who strengthened England. He was met with utter contempt by his closest neighbors. His end was a perfect summary. In 1307, the old man, suffering from opposition but still ruled by him. With Scottish obsession, he marched north again, determined to defeat Robert the Bruce. He died in a small village in the south of Scotland. Border, his eyes were fixed on a land he could never truly conquer. On his deathbed, he caused his son and heir, the future Edward II, to take a terrible oath. To carry his bones at the head of the English army in every future campaign against the Scots, and not to bury his body until a rebellious kingdom is established. Finally subdued. It was the last command, magnificent, terrifying, and completely subdued. Obsessive king. He wanted his son to have the most powerful crown in Europe, but also empty treasury, a spiteful nobility, and a bloody, invincible war. He left him a kingdom forged of iron in the fire, but its foundations were full of debt and hatred. A lion died and the throne passed to a son who was everywhere, in a way that is its polar opposite, as can be imagined. The new King Edward III had no interest in his father's wars, laws, or royal duties. He was a man who he wanted love, not conquest, and he didn't seek it in his palace or his court queen, but from a number of male favorites, most famously the Gascon, a humble knight named Piers Goston. What happens to a kingdom? What happens when wrought iron is inherited by a man who prefers silk? When the war palace was filled with harsh warlords, kings bestowed with titles, lands, and wealth, and the wealth of the kingdom to his personal companions, the great machine of conquest he built. Edward II stood trembling and then about to fall apart. Great fashion. Fall would be faster, more personal, and more brutal. More than anyone can imagine. The reign of Edward II was a slow-motion car accident. He fell apart in an instant. He swore an oath to his dying father. Instead of taking Edward's bones to Scotland, Fern buried them and immediately remembered his beloved peers Gaveston, exiled from France. Gaveston was witty, arrogant, and terrifyingly charming, and the new king was completely. He was obsessed with him. He rewarded Gauston with the highest titles, Count Cornwall, a title reserved for the royal family and the largest lands, had no bearing on him. As a subject, but equally, perhaps more so, the warlords wounded. The men of Fern's court, who had fought and shed blood for the kingdom, looked with disgust at this lowly Gascon. The newcomer mocked them with insulting nicknames and demonstrated his influence. This wasn't just bad politics. This was personal insult of the highest order. The inevitable conflict ensued. The king's powerful cousin, Thomas, a group of angry nobles, Lancaster, forced Edward, the Lord Commander, to adopt a series of radical reforms that limited his power, and most importantly, to exile Gauston forever. But Edward's love was stronger than any law. He remembered that. Gauston again. This was the last mistake, the barons bypassing the king. Completely hunted down Gauston, held a mock trial and executed him. Because Edward, this was an unforgivable act of betrayal, a wound that would never heal. But his disgrace was not over yet. He was tired of the family conflicts. Robert the Bruce was systematically reconquering Scotland. In 1314, Edward finally, he decided to send a large army north to put down the rebellion once and for all. At the Battle of Bannockburn, his huge, poorly managed army was completely destroyed by a smaller, brilliant. He commanded the Scottish army. It was the most humiliating defeat of the English army. History: Edward Fur's great war machine was destroyed by his own army. Son, the last act of his tragedy was written by his wife Isabella. France, circa 12,951,358. Known as the She-Wolf of France, she, the daughter of a powerful French king, was sent to England to become queen, but must be ignored and humiliated by a husband who would rather be with his new favorite, the Despencer family. A woman sent to her brother's palace in Paris on a diplomatic mission refused to return. There, she and her lover, exiled English Baron Roger Mortimer, and together they hatched an unthinkable plan. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer arrived in England with a small mercenary army. The king, Dom, fed up with Edward's disastrous reign, flocked to his banner, Edward II. His reign collapsed overnight. He was taken prisoner, forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son Edward III, and he was arrested. Rumor has it that his end will be a terrible one, a death designed to punish him because of his unnatural feelings. According to the story, he was killed with a red-hot poker. For several years, Isabella and her lover Mortimer ruled England as regents under a reign of greed and tyranny. But they had underestimated the boy they had crowned. They had forgotten that he was a Plantagenet. In 1330, the 17-year-old Edward III made a daring night raid on Nottingham Castle, who arrested Mortimer, had him executed as a traitor, and the mother was in a comfortable but firm house arrest. She had become a little lion. The throne was his, and his rule would change the face of Europe forever. Edward III wasn't just a king, he was a showman. After he regained his throne, he understood that he needed something big to truly erase the disgrace of his father's rule. Project, a glorious adventure that will unite his nervous nobles behind him. He found it across the Channel, the capitals, the royal lineage of France. Died, Edward's mother was Isabella, daughter of the French king. Simply put, according to the logic of inheritance, he claimed to have a stronger claim to the French throne than the new French king, Philip V. French lawyers, terrified of the future of the English king, erased an obscure part of the ancient Salic law. declared that the crown could not be passed down through female descendants. For Edward, this legal trickery was not an obstacle, it was an invitation. It was the perfect excuse for this. The greatest and boldest gamble in the history of his dynasty, a war to claim the French throne. The 100 Years' War had begun. It was something that followed the military revolution that shocked Europe. The French army was its embodiment. Medieval warfare, thousands of heavily armored aristocratic knights, the best in Christendom. They believed that chivalry, their bravery, and their steel plates made them invincible. The English army. It was different. It was a professional force of paid soldiers, and its secret weapon was a 6-foot yew-wood pole. English longbow. In the hands of a trained man, the longbow was a medieval machine gun, firing 10-12 arrows per minute, pointed arrows designed to pierce armor. The two systems clashed at the Battle of Say in 1346. The French, arrogant and undisciplined knights, advanced uphill in a series of useless waves, straight into the blizzard. English arrows. Chroniclers described the darkening of the sky in miles. It was not a battle, it was an execution. The flower of the French nobility was killed where they stood. 10 years later, the story was repeated at Poitiers, but with a more spectacular outcome. The British army, led Edward's charismatic son and heir, the Black Prince, found himself in the hands of Edward, cornered by a vastly superior French force. In a stunning display of tactical through ingenuity and archery, the English not only defeated the French, but also won the ultimate prize. They captured the king. King John II of France himself. This was checkmate on the European chessboard. The King of England now held the King of France hostage. For Edward III and his son, this was the height of glory. They had created a new cult of chivalry centered around the newly created Order of Knights, the brotherhood of the nation's greatest warriors. This is how the Black Prince was welcomed. The living embodiment of knightly virtue, treating a royal captive like this. Even when armies were ravaging the French countryside, polite courtesy prevailed. The savage raids known as the Chevaques, England was madly shaken by the victory. Rich with French booty and ransom money, the Plantagenet lion did not simply roar. He ate the flesh of his greatest rival, but he couldn't stay at the top of the sun forever. The golden afternoon of Edward III's reign slowly turned into a long landscape. Gray twilight. The great king, victorious over the Cree, was condemned to an untimely death. Syl becomes an old maid manipulated by her lover, Alice Perez. The war in France, once a source of endless glory and spoils, has become a quagmire. A costly and demoralizing quagmire. The French, under the leadership of their cunning new king, Charles I, learned to avoid intense battles, preferring the strategy of guerrilla warfare, which was a slow-moving bloodbath. The British invaders are drying up. The territory won with British blood is lost through destruction and diplomacy, and then came the most brutal blow. In 1376, a year before his father, the great hero Edward the Black Prince, he did not die in battle, but withered away from a long illness. The perfect heir, the epitome of English chivalry, had left behind his own son. A 9-year-old boy named Richard was appointed heir to the throne. It was a glorious me ended not with a bang, but with a cough and a sigh. But the true legacy of Edward III was. It is more complex and more dangerous than just a fading war and a child king. To continue the great French adventure, he had created a new nobility. He had raised his younger sons to an unprecedented height of power, creating a series of powerful kingdoms for them. Lionel, Duke of Clarence, Con, Duke of Lancaster, Edmund, Duke of York, Thomas, the Duke of Gloucester. They were princes of the bloodline, very wealthy, and possessed great wealth. Estates and private armies made up of loyal soldiers of the French wars, battle-hardened veterans. Edward was powerful, but this pride of lions served his will. But now, the old king dies and a boy is about to inherit the crown. These super nobles were no longer just pillars of the throne, they were potential rivals. The 100 Years' War had taught the English aristocracy that war could be profitable. This militarized them, gave them a taste of power and a large personal following. Edward had blown the wind to conquer France. His grandson Richard II. He left behind a poisonous cup, a kingdom that he knew how to fight, but he was beginning to forget who the real enemy was. The golden age is over. A boy sits on the throne. And around that throne roam his powerful, ambitious, and warlike uncles, the sons of the great. Edward III. This is a recipe for disaster. New Richard II would grow up to be a very different man from his father and grandfather. He was not a warrior, a person who believes in the divine, absolute, and inviolable majesty of the kingdom, a lover of art and refinement. He saw his powerful nobles not as advisors, but as threats to be crushed. Now the stage is set for a colossal clash of wills. On one side, a king believes that his power comes directly from God. On the other hand, the line of princes who believe that their power comes from of royal blood and swords. The Plantagenet family predicted its power, which has been directed outward for a century, is about to turn that fierce energy inward. The first cracks in the great dynasty are about to appear, and they will stem from a Plantagenet fall. This is the act that will light the fuse of the bomb that will eventually destroy them all. Wars. The roses are coming, but first a king must be overthrown. Richard II grew up in the shadow of lions and began to consider himself a god. He was the son of a black prince, the grandson of Edward III, but he had none of their bellicose pragmatism. He, a delicate man with an almost theatrical sensibility, he patronized the poet. Chaucer presented the handkerchief to the English court and believed fervently in the divine right of kings. Unshakable faith. For him, the king was not the chief executive of the state. He was the living icon of God on earth and was responsible only to his creator. It was a beautiful theory. In the cruel world of Plantagenet politics, it was a suicide note. His reign began with a trial by fire. In 1381, the Great Peasants' Revolt sweeps England, a violent revolt against taxes and serfdom. The 14-year-old king showed amazing personal courage. He confronts the rebels, promises them justice, and resolves the crisis. It horrified his government, but this early success taught him the wrong lesson, convinced him of his own semi-divine charisma, his ability to command obedience through the power of his will. As he grew up, his palace became a luxurious place, a bubble of culture and sophistication, completely separate from the scary, warlike, the realities of his nobility. His powerful uncles and their successors who fought in France saw a king who they preferred worthy favorites to war machine advisors. They hated wastefulness, short-livedness, and dangerous slide towards tyranny. Their conflict was led by a group of nobles. Richard, known as the Lord's Complainant, saw his friends humiliated and executed. He surrendered, but never. He forgave. He waited for years, then responded with cold anger. A man whose divinity was in doubt. His uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, had been murdered. He was exiled or executed the other appellants. He began to rise to power as a true autocrat, retreating Parliament, increasing mandatory loans, and making it clear that its word is law. The law that cannot be questioned. His last fatal act of arrogance was aimed at his cousin Henry Boling, 1367–1413, son of the very powerful John, Duke of Lancaster of Gaunt. Henry was everything Richard was not: famous, pragmatic, famous warrior. Fearing him, Richard exiled him. But when old John died and Richard went one step further, he disinherited his cousin. Completely, he seized the entire vast Lancaster estate for the crown. It was a move that tore the kingdom apart. It was a direct attack on the holy, the principle of property and inheritance, which forms the basis of the entire aristocratic system. This made every landowner in England tremble. If the king, he could do it to the Duke of Lancaster, he could do it to anyone. While Richard was comfortably away on campaign in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke arrived in England and claimed that he was only comes to reclaim his rightful inheritance. The terrified nobles. Richard's tyranny flowed to his banner. Richard's support disappeared. When he returned, he found that he was a king without a kingdom. He was taken prisoner and torn to pieces. As the leader of a political theater that would change England forever, he was formally removed from office in Parliament. An anointed king, God's representative on earth, was stripped of his crown. Subjects, the spell of monarchy was broken. Richard disappeared into prison, almost certainly quietly murdered there. Early the following year, Henry Bolingbroke, the first king of Lancaster, was Henry IV. But his crown was forever tarnished by the original sin of eugenics. He seized the throne not by the grace of God, but by force of arms, and dangerous precedent. If one Plantagenet could take the throne from another, why no others? His reign was plagued by rebellions. His son, the great Henry V. He brilliantly covered up this constitutional flaw by restarting the war in France and uniting the nation behind him. In the glorious, impossible victory at Azinur, for a moment he thought that Lancaster, the dynasty, was secure, but Henry V's glory was fragile. He died young, leaving the throne to his only child, the 9-month-old baby Henry VI. The old wound of Usurpasia was about to open, and this time the bleeding did not stop until almost every Plantagenet claimant to the throne was dead. The glorious blood-soaked crown of Henry V was his son Henry V, and he was everything his father was not. Where his father was a warrior, Henry was a scholar. Where his father was determined, Henry was cripplingly indecisive. He was a gentle, religious, and deeply kind man. A man who would have been a magnificent monk, but disastrously unfit to be a Plantagenet king. His great life achievements include the founding of Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. Islands of learning and prayer in a kingdom that was rapidly sharpening its knives. Worse, he was suffering. It is likely that a debilitating mental illness inherited from his French grandfather caused his long-term illness. Periods of catatonic stupor leave him completely unresponsive to the world. A Holy Spirit on the throne, a void at the center of government. And in the cruel world of Plantagenet politics, a vacuum never stays empty for long. That leads to a storm. The storm has come. The Duke of York in the person of his cousin Richard. York was the antithesis of the king. He was the richest man in England, a skilled administrator, an experienced military commander, and the most dangerous. Most importantly, he had a claim to the throne under his strict laws. The first generation, which was stronger than Henry himself. He was not from generation to generation. Like the Lancastrians, they descended from the younger son of Edward III, and through him. Edward's second surviving son was Lionel of Clarence, Lancaster. The claim came from the third son. According to the figures, York was the legitimate king, because over the years, he was loyal but constantly sidelined by a group around the king. Was under the rule of the ruthlessly ambitious Queen Margaret of Anjou and her favorite, the Duke of Somerset. The kingdom began to fall apart along these fault lines. On one side, the Lancastrians who were on the palace side were symbolized. The red rose is left helpless to protect its pitiful king and its own power. The other was the growing York party, symbolized by the white bullet, and whoever saw it They presented themselves as reformers trying to rid the government of corruption and incompetence. The final catalyst was a national disgrace. In the early 1450s, the last English territory in France was. The glorious conquests of Henry V were lost. The 100 Years' War ended and England had lost. The blame fell squarely on the weak king and his corrupt government. It was then that, at that moment, Henry V fell into his first major catatonic state. Since the king was essentially a living corpse, Parliament had no choice but to appoint the Duke of York as his guardian. York ruled well, but when the king miraculously recovered for a year, Queen Margaret then immediately dismissed York from office and reversed his reforms. For York and his powerful allies, especially the Neville family, led by the Earl of Warwick, soon to be known as the Kingmaker, this was the last straw. They had tasted power and were driven out. There was only one way out. Now settle the dispute. At the first Battle of St. Albans in 1455, the Yorkists and Lancastrians clashed in the streets of the city. Blood was shed. Wars. The Roses had begun. This was no longer a political dispute. This was a blood feud. For the next 30 years, Edward III's grandchildren, Lions, the Plantagenet Dinas, would tear each other apart in a savage rage. Ambition, betrayal, and slaughter. The war was a bloody saw. The Yorkists were initially victorious. The Duke of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, his head decorated with mockery, with a paper crown by Queen Margaret's forces, but her handsome son, a charismatic giant named Edward Earl of March, he rose from the life of his father. He was a brilliant military commander, a true Plantagenet warrior. In 1461, Edward defeated him in the horribly bloody Battle of Taunton, which took place in a snowstorm. The Lancastrian army was probably the largest and deadliest battle ever fought on English soil. He participated in the coronation ceremony. King Edward I Thor, Henry Vex and his formidable queen fled into exile for a time. For 10 years, York seemed to have won. But despite all his power, Edward of Tully, his brilliance had a fatal weakness for women, his secret marriage to a commoner. The widowed Elizabeth Woodville turned away from her strongest ally, Warwick. Kingmaker fleeing to the Lancastrians, Warwick forced to side with Edward IV. Fled, and the bewildered Henry V was briefly restored to the throne. A pathetic pawn in a game he no longer understands. But Edward came back, defeated and killed. They captured Warwick and finally Henry VI. This time there would be no second. Luck, on the night Edward IV returned to London in triumph, Henry VI. He was quietly murdered in the Tower of London. His line was destroyed. Edward reigned for another 12 years. The king, who loved feasting and women more than war, brought much-needed peace to the exhausted kingdom. And then in 1483, he died suddenly at the age of just 40, most likely due to a stroke he caused. He was known for his extravagant lifestyle. He left behind 2 young sons to inherit the estate. His throne, 12-year-old Edward V and his younger brother Richard, and he left behind a brother to protect them. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, 1,452,485. Music, the last bore of the Plantagenet line. What happens next is one of the most toxic and controversial secrets in English history. Richard, a loyal and proven. Under his brother, he took control as commander, Lord Protector. He later declared Edward the son of Thor, illegally, claiming that his brother had entered into a prenuptial agreement with another woman before marrying Elizabeth Woodville. The 2 young princes were placed in the Tower of London for their safety. They were seen playing in the gardens. They disappeared after a while. After the throne became vacant, Richard of Gloucester became Richard III. Did he kill his own nephews? Centuries of TUD propaganda have come to an end. He is portrayed as a giant, goblin-like villain. His modern supporters claim he was a victim. Smear campaign. We'll never know for sure, but the boys were never seen. Again, Richard's reign was short and doomed. His seizure of the throne. Regardless of the motives, it was a brutal act that shook the Yorkist party. The Plantagenet dynasty was already eating its own children. Across the channel, a final, unexpected. A claim was pending, which was a link to the Lancaster line, its name. Henry was at Tudor. In August 1485 he landed in Wales, at Bosworth Field. The final act was played out. Richard III, betrayed by some of his leading nobles, saw Henry Teuton's flag on the other side of the square, in a final, desperate attack that he deserved. While he was destroying his ancestors, he tried to destroy his opponent personally. He was defeated, surrounded, and beaten. Death a fight to the end. They say his last words were treason. Treason, treason. The crown that had fallen from his head was picked up from somewhere. Hawthorne Bush and Henry Teuton's head. Plantagenet dynasty. The lion that ruled England for 331 years is extinct. And so it was all over. The great roar of the Plantagenet lion echoed. For 3 centuries, Europe had become a dying breath in the mud. Learsham Field, the house that gave birth to Henry II the Lionheart. Edward I and Edward III had finally destroyed themselves. Our treasure hunt is over, the answer to how such a dynasty came to be. The wild energy could have destroyed itself, scattered across the bloody battlefields of the Wars of the Roses. They were a family that had mastered the art of war against their enemies, but had never learned to make peace with them. Themselves, now when the dust settles and a new cautious Tudor sun begins to rise. England, it's time to retreat. It's time to survey the ruins and gather together the deepest lessons from the ruins of this dynasty. What is the lasting legacy of these French kings who created by chance? England, what eternal truths about power, ambition, and human nature might there be? Found in their magnificent ascent, and even more magnificent self-imitation, music. So we stand at the end of our treasure hunt, in a foggy area in the center of town. England with the crown plucked from the thorn bush, the answer to our great question: how could a dynasty with such power bring about its own destruction now? Their legacy is a deep and bloody paradox, their first and most. An eternal legacy is a legacy they never intended to create. The English nation itself. These were the French. Princes, they spoke French, dreamed of French vineyards, and bankrupted English kingdoms for the sake of the French language. Ambitions, yet they became the accidental architects of Englishness. The common law of Henry II gave. England was a unified legal backbone. John's spectacular failure earned him Magna. The card is the first manifestation of the idea that the king's power is not absolute. Edward III's endless need for war taxes forced him to call Parliament and voice to the knights and merchants he kidnapped. The most ironic is 100 red years. The war shaped their large family project into a fiercely independent English identity. The Plantagenets themselves were destined to be opposed to the French culture from which they had emerged, but at the same time, the furnace that created the nation also created its own weapons of destruction, and this is their second. A tragic legacy. The 100 Years' War transformed the English nobility from provincial landowners into warriors. The tough CEOs of private armies. These men, the Bowerts, the Nevilles, etc. Percy learned his craft in the brutal Battle of Chevre across France. In that war, after the failure, they brought home their skills, their soldiers, and their passion for violence. The Plantagenets had released a pack of wolves to hunt the French, and then they were surprised when the hunt began. The starving herd rebelled against its masters. The Wars of the Roses were not a new war. This was the last stage of cannibalism of the old, over a large area. In history, the Plantagenets were a violent, chaotic, and brilliant bridge between the Norman conquest and the Tudor state. They inherited a kingdom, they left a nation, but their story is this: an eternal warning about the nature of power itself. German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "A person who fights monsters must be careful not to become a monster himself." Monstrosity. The Plantagenets fought the monstrosities of their time: anarchy, foreign kings, rebellious barons, but in their long and bloody struggle for absolute power, the greatest monster emerged from within his own family. Finally, the creature of ambition and blood rivalry that devoured him: your own heart. Thank you for joining us at Dynasty Saga on this magnificent journey. Has gone through 3 centuries of glory and ruin. If you have enjoyed this intellectual work, treasure hunt, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a future chronicle. Now the question is for you: which dynasty? Want our next investigation? The Medici bankers of Florence, the Habsburgs, Austria, or maybe China's Han Dynasty? Let us know in the comments below. Until then, next time, keep asking questions and looking for the stories hidden behind the crown. Goodbye.